Chapter 1, Milk. It's the official start of 10th grade, and everyone is texting and talking at the same time, even though the person they're texting is probably less than 10 feet away. But if you can do both and do them well, your coolness quotient is obviously very high. Mine, I'm afraid, is in the negative digits, but then again, it probably always has been. And on with the summer pictures. For the C group, trips to the Black Hills or the Wisconsin Dells. For the kids next up the ladder, Disney World, out west somewhere like a bunch of national parks or maybe California. For the ultra rich, even farther. Sue Tilford, her father is president of the Fullerton Savings and Loan and has lent my father lots of money to keep our farm going, went to a fancy summer camp in France to learn to speak the language so she'd be ready for some equally fancy college in a few years, and a group of girls from the first two groups crowd around her like she's some kind of rock star, oohing and awing over her pictures of the actual Eiffel Tower. And there are plenty of other pictures of places closer to home. Lots of tanning on the raft at Woodland Lake in between shifts at the Dairy Queen or the canning factory, or after hot July days walking soybean fields to weed out the corn that isn't supposed to be there, but that always manages to get mixed up with the soybean seeds. I don't have a cell phone, and will probably never get one unless I can talk my father into joining the 21st century, or I find some way to pay for it myself. Too expensive, my father says whenever I ask for one. And besides which, this whole texting insanity is destroying what little there is left of the English language, not to mention the destruction of face-to-face social discourse. Whatever that is. As a former high school English teacher, he is very concerned about such things, and I should be too, because someday, he says, the world would belong to me. I don't want the world, at least not all of it, but it doesn't matter. There's no one I want to text anyway. If there were someone I wanted to talk to, I'd do it in person. That would please my father to no end. But for now, more than anything, I just want my piece of paper telling me where to be the Tuesday after Labor Day, the first day of school, what my locker combination is, what teachers I'll have to endure 5 days a week for the next 9 months. And even if I did have a cell phone, I wouldn't have any pictures to show. There are no vacations when you own a dairy farm, my father says, and often. It's 25 hours a day, 8 days a week, 366 days a year. Hello, friends, and welcome to another episode of Reading Rural YAL, where we talk all things Rural YA literature to the authors who write it, and now to the readers who read it. I am your host, Dr. Chea Parton, and I am so excited for this episode because I'm trying something new. Usually for these book talks, y'all just listen to me talk to you about the book. I do the reading at the beginning, I give a summary and a mini analysis, and then talk about some teaching ideas for the book. Well, I got tired of listening to just my voice, so I've invited some guests to talk about the book with me. I'm still going to do a reading of the first pages, which you heard at the beginning of this episode. Mostly just to try to quench my desire to be an audiobook narrator, and I'll still provide you with a summary of the book, but for the analysis and teaching ideas part, you're going to be hearing from pre-service teachers, in-service teachers, and teacher educators. You may have looked at the time of this episode and how long it is and thought, man, this is a lot longer than usual, and it is because there are 3 people on this episode talking about this book, and it is wonderful. For this episode, I am joined by 2 pre-service teachers from Western Illinois University, Maya and Grace, and they are phenomenal. They are super smart and insightful, and it was an absolute joy to talk with them about the complicated calculus and cows of Carl Paulsen. Not only do we talk about the book, but at the beginning we have a conversation about the importance of having experiences teaching in rural spaces as pre-service teachers, and I have goosebumps just thinking about it. We get to the book about the 30-minute mark, but if you're a pre-service teacher, an in-service teacher, or a teacher educator, I really hope you'll listen to that first 30 minutes. Their insights are so thoughtful and evocative, and I think it would benefit all of our teacher education programs if we would listen to what they have to say. So before we get to all of that goodness, I do want to give you a brief summary of the book. The Complicated Cows and Calculus of Carl Paulsen is written by Gary Eldon Peter, who is the legacy of Minnesota dairy farmers. It takes place on such a farm, and 15-year-old Carl, who turns 16 in the middle of the book, grapples with the loss of his mother, his crush on a recent city boy transplant, Andy Olin, and the future of the family's struggling farm. His mother loved the farm and wouldn't want to let it go, but how can they honor that dream while achieving financial security for the family? This is a tender and complex tale of resilience, unrequited love, father son relationships, and farm life. It's really good. I hope you'll get you a copy. So, now on to the good stuff. I couldn't hardly bring myself to edit out a single minute of this conversation. I am so glad I decided to switch things up, and I think you will be too. So, here we go. On to the interview. Hey, y'all, and welcome back to another episode of Reading Rural YAL, where we talk about all things rural YA literature and to the authors who write them. Today, I'm so excited because we're starting something new. For these book talk episodes, usually y'all are just listening to me talk about the books, but I decided I wanted to start talking to other folks about these books, especially pre-service teachers, in-service teachers, and so today I have with me Maya and Grace, who are pre-service teachers at Western Illinois University. And today we're going to be talking about The Complicated Calculus and Cows of Carl Paulsen by Gary Eldon Peter. So I'm so excited to talk to y'all. Welcome and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for inviting us on. This is so exciting. I'm very glad that we were able to connect.
Likewise. Okay, so first question, my obsession, the thing that I ask everyone is where are you from and how do you feel like that has impacted who you are as a person and for y'all as readers and future teachers?
So actually, funnily enough, Grace and I ended up going to the same high school. So we're both from a suburb of Chicago called St. Charles, Illinois. Um, I chose Western for a college because it was really affordable for me. I was able to just worm my way into lots of scholarships and talent grants and stuff like that. And so it was the best fiscal choice for me. I came to Macomb my sophomore year because of COVID. I'm a little bit immunocompromised, so I decided to stay home for my freshman year, and I lived in the dorms. Um, Culture shock is putting it mildly. Macomb is about half the size of the suburb that we're from, and we're from, I suppose, a smaller suburb of Chicago, but it's still very, very suburban. And moving to a really rural town has definitely changed my perspective on a lot of things. And it's also been a very different setting to learn to teach in. The kids that I'm working with have grown up in rural towns their whole lives. They've grown up in towns of like 200, 400, these very, very, very small towns. Um, and I'm working with those students, so it's been really interesting to switch that up.
Yeah, so not to repeat what Maya said, but I'm also from St. Charles. So definitely I would say it's been a bit of a culture shock moving to Macomb. I chose Western because they actually have kind of like a sneakily good education program. I know we're more known for our LEJA and like our I'm forgetting the word right now. But like
Police
we have a couple
stuff.
of
Yeah.
law enforcement programs, things like that. But when I was researching schools, I was looking for a solid education program, and Western kept popping up as like a great education school, and it just wasn't one of the big names in Illinois or in the Midwest. So I ended up coming here. I also love purple. It's one of my favorite colors. So I was like, I'd rather wear purple than, like blue or orange or something. So, but yeah, no, it's been a little bit weird. I've been here, this is my junior year, so I've been here for 2.5 years now. It'll be three by the end of the year. But yeah, it's been a bit of an adjustment going from living somewhere where everything is, like within a 5-10 minute drive to now the closest thing is at least 10 minutes away. If not, you got to go 30, 40 an hour away. Um just to get like your basic stuff. And it's been a little bit weird, but I like it here. It's a good place.
I was gonna ask more about that. What do you feel like are the like starkest differences between um, a suburban life and a rural life, or like teaching or and learning in a suburban school versus teaching and learning in a rural school?
Um, One of the main things for me was business hours. And that sounds like a small thing, but it's really not. I like used to be huge night owl, and that's sort of changed now that I'm in the classroom a little bit more, with practicum and stuff like that. But I like, I could wake up at like, or go to bed at like 2 a.m. and maybe I get hungry at 1 a.m. and I can go and find food. I could go to the gym. I could do whatever I wanted to, and things close around here at like 9. And so that was a lot. I also I did my first semester of block teaching, which is something that we do at Western. We do 2 semesters of block teaching and then student teaching, which means that we're in one classroom with one teacher for one period every day
Mm.
for 8 weeks. So that was a really really cool experience, um, but it was a lot different than what I had anticipated it might be, because my graduating class was around 660 something. Yep. So the high school that we went to had about 2,500 kids in it at any given time. You had no idea who anybody was, and that was the way that I liked it. Anonymity was absolutely a thing. And then I get put in a classroom with 14 juniors.
Mm.
That's it. And in their graduating class, there are 34 of them.
Mhm.
They have known each other since before kindergarten. They grew up, you know what I mean? It's 3 different towns that feed into this one like school, and it's 6 through 12, and there were like less than 150 kids there total. Um, and that was such a different experience, because when you go into a classroom from where I'm from, you still have that anonymity. You don't really know who you are. Everybody's kind of like starts off on a clean slate. There's no clean slates in
Mm.
rural life, I would say.
Mm.
I got there, and like the teacher that I was with knows all of these kids' parents.
Mhm.
You know what I mean? She's like, "Oh, you didn't do your homework. Let me just text your mom." Like, very different.
What about you, Grace? What kind of insights have what for you feels like, the biggest difference?
So I haven't done my block teaching yet.
Mhm.
I do that next semester. So I
Okay.
haven't quite been in a classroom yet, but I have worked with, like students in Macomb. There's been a couple of writing festivals that I've volunteered at. And yeah, honestly, it's just the fact that everybody knows each other. It's just a little bit weird because even in my hometown, like if like you had your connections and you would, you had your network and you knew people who knew people and you would like, build that out. But even then, there's no way to know everybody in a 2,500 person high school, or even everybody in your six. Yeah, I think my class was similar. It was like 600 something kids.
Mhm.
There's no way to know everybody, and there were people walking across my graduation stage who I didn't even know their name. And here that's like not that's just not a thing that you hear of, like. And then something else that I noticed is that my classmates who, like in college, who, grew up here and then also like go here, they know everybody who also grew up here. And it's like a little, like they have their own little community. Um,
Macomie homies.
Macomie homies, yes.
Ah,
So
fun.
that's like a thing. And I heard that and I was like, what are you talking, like Macomie homies? Like, what are you talking about? And yeah, so it's just like they all know each other. Like some of them are like, cousins, or they like went to
Mhm.
kindergarten together, or they were best friends in middle school. And it's just like so weird because it's like I me and Maya weren't like exactly friends in high school. So when I came to Western, I was like, oh, I don't have any friends from high school coming here. I'm all on my own. Um, so it's just weird to think like, oh, imagine going to college with someone who I, like went to preschool with. It's just like a weird thought to me.
That's so interesting. So I had a similar but opposite experience. I went to a high school that had probably like 350 to 400 students.
Total?
Yeah.
Oh.
Um, maybe, and I'm not, I think that might be 6 through 12, but I can't remember exactly for sure. But there were 50 people in my graduating class. Um, and so when I went to Purdue for my undergrad, there was like one other person from my class who I wasn't particularly good friends with. Like I knew him really well, but like we didn't run in the same social circles. We just weren't really very good friends. And so like I come to this, behemoth Big Ten university with 40,000 people on campus, and I don't know anyone. And there are the same number of people who live in my town living in my dorm building. And so like it was just bizarre to go to somewhere bigger and not know anybody there in the same way that y'all have come from somewhere larger to somewhere smaller and you don't know anybody, like I just think that's a really interesting, it's just interesting the movement across places and the way that size affects how we relate to people in different places, how the number of people and where we've come from influences like how we interact with people. I'm curious because, one of the major stereotypes about rural places is that they aren't very welcoming of outsiders. And so sort of thinking about the Macomb homies and that kind of thing at Western, like, did you feel that they were reticent to sort of like bring you into the community fold, or do you feel like it was really welcoming? Like, what was your experience with that?
Well, I can't speak for Grace, but I feel like for the most part everybody's pretty welcoming here. And I think that that is partially because it's a college town.
Mm.
So a lot of it revolves because it's the town population is 15,000-ish. And then that includes I think the school, which is we've got 7,000
Mm.
people. So when they leave, the town goes down. And I
Right.
think they're very used to people coming and going
Mm.
for Western. And yeah, I mean there's always that sense of okay, I'm an outsider if you've grown up here. But it's more of a like you add a layer to that instead of
Mm.
exclusion, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah, I definitely think that the people who have grown up in Macomb, who I've like become friends with, there's like this just whole other like underground layer to like the town and like the culture and everything that I wouldn't have even like been able to like brush the surface of. If I was just like here for school because I'm on campus, I'm in my dorm, I'm not really going out because I'm doing my schoolwork all the time. So the couple of friends that I've made, they've shown me like, different places to go to, like what time, like the bowling alley is open until like, they have all these connections because, a smaller town. And so we can just like go around and hang out and like there's all these different places that I wouldn't have even, thought to explore had I not known someone who had, like been here and lived here for so long. So I think that that's awesome because it's like you come here and you're new and you're an outsider and you're not used to like living in such a small place and then you have these people who are like, "Hey, let me show you like all the cool parts about our town." And then it's like, "Okay, yeah, this is very cool and this is very interesting." And it's just like so awesome to see.
I think
It's
there's also another really big thing that we kind of haven't touched on yet is the gossip
mm.
part of that. Everybody's in everybody's business here, which is very interesting and not something that I am used to, um, outside of like my immediate family. So coming here and talking with like Macomb homies, they're like, "Oh yeah, like did you hear about so and so?" I'm like, "No, how do you know? Like where are you hearing this? Who's telling you this?" And then it's like they know stuff about like the faculty because they all live here, and
Mm.
it's just like it's kind of a wild thing.
It's interesting because I think a lot of people usually focus on the negative aspects of that, right? But for me, when I was growing up, like I always focused on the positive aspects of that, which is like if everybody knows what's happening with you, they know how to help you. And so when you know that like, like somebody's Uncle Frankie has been, hurt in a farming accident and or is sick or whatever and needs help pulling their crops in, then everybody gets out their stuff and they go help pull his crops in. Like if you know that so and so's family is struggling and they're too proud to ask for help because like also is kind of like part of like the rural country characteristic, like then you know that you can help them in these ways that are considered culturally acceptable. while still preserving their pride and dignity. And so I've heard Appalachian scholars refer to this as like kin care or community care. And so I feel like that sort of rumor mill and the gossip chain can be negative in some ways, but I think that a lot of people forget that it can also be really positive in a lot of ways because, like I said, if you know everybody's business, then you know how to help them when they need help. So even if they don't ask for it, or even if they wouldn't ask for it because they're too proud to, you know?
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic point and something that I haven't really considered, but probably should have. Over the summer, we had pretty bad. I think there was like two tornadoes that hit one after the other here,
Mm-hmm.
and silos were like ripped out of the ground and thrown across. And like
Mm-hmm.
I remember insurance companies had to come and like assess damages and give out really big checks. And a lot of my friends who grew up within the hour of the area, they, like I know that one of my friend's dads like hurt his back really bad and had to get surgery helping move all of like the tree limbs out of people's farms, and it's like the whole town bands together in a way that just doesn't happen in the suburbs, because you don't know, you don't have, you're not close with your neighbors in the same way.
Right.
Yeah.
100%. Um, Grace, did you have anything that you wanted to add to that, or is it okay if I ask another question?
Well, I was just gonna say, like the friends that I've made who are not necessarily from Macomb, but also like from small towns, there's like just a really strong sense of like helping your community,
Mm-hmm.
which is something that like I try to have, but it's not something that I necessarily see back in my hometown. But it's like a lot of my friends who are from like the smaller towns, it's like if you text them at 2 a.m. and you need a ride, they will get in their car. They will give you a ride. Like if you need directions, if you know, like get a flat tire and you're an hour away, they will come up and help you, like no questions asked. And I'm like, that's just really like special. Like you don't find that. You know, obviously like my
Yeah.
family back home would help me, but I couldn't just call anybody up from my high school and they wouldn't drop everything and come help me. So it's great to it's great.
There's a lot more of a sense of, you're on your own, like it's every man for himself up there near the city.
And I think that's easier when there's like more resources and amenities that individuals can access, but like the remoteness, not all places that are rural are remote, but all remote places are usually rural, you know.
Mm.
But like historically, that, the remoteness that kind of comes with being rural sometimes. Lends like that's a necessity. Like you have to help each other out because y'all have. And so if you don't help anyone and nobody helps you, then nobody's getting help from anywhere. you know so in order to help the community survive, like you learn that it's important to help one another. And so you do those things for one another because you know that you know what whoever you're helping out now is probably going to have to help you out at some point. And so the whole community just kind of bands together because historically they've had to. And even as like, vehicles and that kind of like technology has advanced, like the the sort of culture of community and kin care has stuck around, which is one of my favorite things about being a rural person. Um, just knowing that, there are folks who will take the shirt off their back, even if that's the only one that they got, to help you because they know what it's like to need help and they expect other people to help them too, um, so I wondered if y'all are considering teaching in a rural place for your futures. Like, I know, Grace, you said you haven't been in a rural classroom yet, but just experiencing what it's like to be in a rural community. Like, is rural teaching a possibility or sort of like on your radar in terms of your future teaching lives?
So actually that's a funny question because right now my plan is after I graduate, I want to move into Chicago and teach in an urban school
Yep.
because I went to school in a suburban school, went to college in a rural town, and then I can, get a
Mm,
couple of years of teaching in like a, like a central city school. And then from there, I kind of have a little bit more experience with like everywhere. And so then I feel like I would be able to make a better judgment on where I
mm,
want to be. Um, but yeah, I just like it was like an unintentional plan. But I was like, oh, I went to school here and now I'm in college here. And so might as well go teach, in Chicago, which is like kind of the next step. And then after that, then it's once I have the experience, I can be like, okay, which one do I like best and which one do I feel the most comfortable in, and then that's probably where I would like put down my roots for later.
I think that's a good plan. I think that's a great plan. What about you, Maya?
Yeah, right now the plan is to move home for student teaching so that I can save up some money.
Mm,
And then I might work for a year at home
mm-hmm.
after that. So I'll go back to the suburbs. But then my plan is to move to Seattle
Okay.
or around Seattle. Um, and it's really wherever I can find affordable housing that can fit my soon to be very giant dog. Um, and then that way, if it ends up being a rural area, I think that I'll feel comfortable enough to teach there. If it ends up being a suburban area, I think I'll feel comfortable to teach there as well. Like Grace said, having that experience is invaluable. And yeah, and it's also been on my radar too. I've been considering maybe one year I try to teach in Chicago. Like we just full send go to inner city schools
Mm.
because there's no way to learn unless you throw yourself in the deep end sometimes.
Mm. Yeah, I've been having conversations with our teacher preparation people, the sort of higher ups than me, about the importance of helping and facilitating students to have practicum experiences across all of the different places, because like place matters, and I don't think that everybody understands that. But like, it's I think it's important to have experiences everywhere, because if you don't, then you really don't know where the best fit is for you. And the best fit for you may not be where you're from, even though I think that's the assumption that we all make. But that's really interesting. So let's say you don't end up in a rural school. How do you think your learning about rural education is going to impact the way that you teach in non-rural places?
Well, I think that the most significant thing about being in a rural community is the shattering of all the stereotypes and presumptions that I personally had as I mean, not necessarily like I would say sheltered, but definitely sheltered from rural life,
Mm,
living in a suburban area. You have these preconceived notions of what farming communities and what more agrarian communities are like, and then you kind of get there and it's just not. I mean, it's nothing's ever the way that you think. If you're basing something off of having no knowledge, of course you're going to have those stereotypes changed. But it's been very interesting, and I just think that that would be able to reflect in my teaching for sure, is that I can make sure that I can help shatter some stereotypes myself whenever I'm teaching that way, and I can include rural literature in my curriculum because I think it's incredibly important for everybody to have knowledge about all areas. Because as you're saying, a lot of people do not understand just how different life is in all of these different places. And I think that if we were to have a better understanding of that, we'd have a better understanding of the people that live there, which would increase empathy and maybe just make us all better people.
Gracie, you have anything you want to add?
I mean, I would say it helps, and I don't want to say this as in like I'm not even a teacher yet and I'm already looking at all my students as one blob with no personality, but like seeing every student as an individual, and I think that working in different places helps us with that because my cousin is a teacher in Chicago right now.
Mm,
And so she taught kindergarten through the pandemic, and
mm.
through she taught bilingual kindergarten online with no internet access for most of the kids. So she's a hero. But like that was something that you really have to consider. It's like what like resources do my students have? Like
Mm.
what does their home life look like? Like what can I expect them reasonably to get done in an evening or in a semester or whatever? And then what can I not? Um because it's just like every student is so different, and then the ways that they are different varies from place to place. So depending like in a rural town, depending on like if your student lives on a farm and needs to help with a harvest or something, or like if they live somewhere without internet access, or if they live somewhere where like they don't have access to libraries or books, like anything like that, where it's like what can I do in order to, like breach the gap and say like, okay, this is how I want you to learn, and this is how I'm going to teach, regardless of what resources any of you might have access to.
And I think our hope too is like, especially because I teach a multicultural education class as part of the transitioning to teaching program at Purdue. And I start with place first, and we talk a lot about rurality, obviously, because like that's my thing. But also I think it matters for multicultural education. I think that rural culture should be part of the cultural and multicultural. Um, and and in that we talk about how like the funds of knowledge that students bring into the classroom too is different. So not only like the resources that they have outside of the classroom is different, but also the resources and the knowledges and cultures and languages that they bring into the classroom is also different. And so I think and I hope that like no matter where y'all end up, that you are inclusive in your curriculum in terms of geospatial differences, because I think I say this a lot, and maybe now would be a good segue to like the book. I'm thoroughly enjoying it. Like this is fascinating to me, and thank you for sharing and being open about sharing your experiences and stuff. Um, I I say this a lot that like urban literature finds its way into rural classrooms a lot, but rural literature does not often find its way into urban classrooms, or suburban classrooms. So I think that making sure that all different kinds of geospatial experiences are represented in literature in different places in different classrooms is really important, because all students deserve mirrors and all students deserve windows and, the chance at opening a sliding glass door. So I think that's one of the things that really inspired me to start this podcast. And I think I'm feeling really excited and validated by y'all's talking about your experiences, that might start to happen, that rural literature might start to find its way into more suburban and urban classrooms. So speaking of rural literature, so the book that we're here to talk about today, as I said in the top of the episode, is The Complicated Calculus and Cows of Carl Paulsen. And I can't remember who it was. One of y'all sent me an email that was like, I'm on page 11 and I've already cried.
Yeah.
And so if y'all are ready, you want to talk about the book? So I thought maybe first we could talk about like general impressions,
Mhm.
things we liked, things that we didn't like, things that we thought were authentic, things that didn't, register with us or hit home with us. What did y'all think?
Well, just to start, I felt like the writing style was something that I really loved. Like I loved how it was. It's a pretty short book, it's like
Yeah.
150, 160 pages. But there's a lot of really really fantastic like just like lines that are like saturated in wisdom, and then we move on. And there's so much happening in these pages. And it's kind of it's a lot. I like that it's fast moving. I like the voice that it's told in. I liked some of the characters. It was good. Grace and I have talked about the book a little bit just in preparation, but I really liked the writing style. I think that there were a few things that maybe rubbed me a little bit the wrong way.
Mm.
And we can get into that, but um yeah, that's kind of my first impression.
Okay, what about you, Grace?
Yeah, I mean, I read this book through twice, because the first time, honestly, the last page ended, and I was really confused, and I was like, "What just happened? Like, what? Huh?" So I had to give it another read through. And so then once I got through that, and I could really like kind of formulate my thoughts and sift through my thoughts, the pacing of this book was crazy because like it's a really short book, um, and so much happens. Like you're introduced to like not only Carl as a character, but also he has this whole like family life and backstory and like dynamic, um within his family and within his school and everything. And like you get to know that within the first, I think it's like 2 chapters. Like everything that has happened to him in the last like 15, 16 years. Like it's kind of weird how quickly this book is paced. But I really like it because you are never bored. Like it's never you never hit a point where it is dragging or you're not sure what's going to happen next because it's like thing after thing after thing, which is awesome. Um there were a couple of, like, spots that I thought were maybe a little bit sticky, I didn't completely love, but overall, like, the story is great, the character development is fantastic, especially considering it's such a short book, um, And I think that, yeah, some of the messages are definitely like good for students to read, especially students who maybe didn't grow up in a rural town.
Mm.
Having a book like this with an approachable main character and like such an established background and story would be really great to kind of, like you said, offer like a window into that kind of like lifestyle and that perspective.
And introducing the fact that like queer people exist in rural places.
Yeah.
Like sort of like, busting those stereotypes that rural places are just nothing but, white homophobic people, conservative Christian homophobic people. Um, and so your point about the pacing is really interesting because it's not something I had considered before this conversation, but I feel like it mirrors a lot of how Carl feels about the way his life is going. Like it just seems like there's like thing after thing after thing like thrown at him. And so in this moment, where all of these things across his, however many teen years of living, I can't remember exactly how old he is in the book.
He turned
15?
16. He
16.
turned
Okay.
16 in the middle.
Yeah. So 16 years, like everything that has happened to him, I feel like um it's just coming to a head, and there are so many things changing for him and so many things up in the air. And so I feel like in that this is a really brilliant way of form reflecting content because feel overwhelmed sometimes in our reading, just like he feels overwhelmed because of all of the things that are happening to him. And that's not something that I thought about until y'all pointed it out. So thank you for that. This is why this is awesome. I am so excited to continue this talking to other people about the books because I'm going to learn so much more about, the book and um, have so many more opportunities for um,
Different perspectives.
yeah, different perspectives and like different analyses, different angles of analysis. And thank you so much for completing my sentence. So I talk about this, I have a blog about this, but I'm a cooperative overlapper and I do exactly what you just did, usually in conversations with people. And I have been read as rude for doing that before. So I really appreciate that you just did that because it reminds me that I'm not the only one in the world who does it and also lets me know that you were really listening to what I was saying. So thank you very much.
You're
It's not
welcome.
an interruption. You're just building conversation.
Just trying to help.
I know.
Yeah.
Um,
I did want to just bring up quickly because it's like in my mind, and I think I need to talk about it before I move on because I just can't, it's like sticking there. I do want to talk about the way that the sex scene went down.
mm,
And I don't know if that's jumping ahead or anything, but I think
no,
it's just sticking like in the front of my mind. And I just want to talk about it. I think
yeah.
I had to read it through like 4 or 5 times to figure out if it was consensual.
Mm.
And I think that that is not the best thing, personally. I don't know.
So it's funny that you bring that up because I don't have the book. I borrowed Maya's copy, so I wrote myself some notes.
Oh, nice.
And literally throughout my reading, I wrote like the page number and then like my note. And so on page 60 or page 95, I wrote they kissed with two exclamation points. And then when I read through again, I added and had sex because I didn't realize that they
Mm.
had sex until I read it through again. And then I had to read it through like a couple more times to figure out like exactly what happened because if I'm remembering correctly, it was like a paragraph or two where like
Yeah.
things are actually happening. Like there's a lot of build up to
Mm.
it, and then the chapter ends pretty abruptly afterwards. So it took me a while to like really figure out exactly what happened. And like, yeah, it was a little bit confusing in terms of like what was consensual, if it was like who was doing what at what
Mhm.
point. Um, and so that was like one of the kind of spots where, yeah, I remember I read that and I was like, ooh, I don't know about that. And I know that Andy as a character, I really like Carl as a character. Andy as a character, I have a couple of problems with. Um, and that was definitely one of them where I was like, I don't know that putting sex scenes, books with sex, things like that is good for like high school classrooms. Is a good way to help students like develop a perspective of what like healthy casual sex can look like. But I don't know that that scene would have been the best thing to put into a classroom, especially for students who have never encountered like a gay character or a gay person before,
Mm.
because it was just like a little bit iffy on exactly what was going on at that point.
And I think that part of that is intentional because the way that the story is told at times is nonlinear. So it kind of jumps back and forth through memories and perspectives, and that is like interesting. But I just don't like that, like the consent was called into question just because they added smoking marijuana, and they were like kind of not passed. They were passed out, and he didn't get consent before he kissed him, and then but then he was enthusiastic and kind of kissed back, and more occurred, and as we figure that out later, it's like, okay, we kind of understand more about the situation, but reading it at first, it kind of took me back. I was like, what just happened?
And I wonder, so in my recalling my conversation with Gary, because I've already recorded his interview. I did it a while ago, actually. He talked about the difficulty of writing from the character's perspective because the narrator, right, is Carl.
Yeah.
And so what we know is what he knows, and what we experience is what he experiences. And so I think like he's also confused about what happened and what's going on, right? And he is not 100% sure about what happens. And so I think that Gary Eldon Peter is trying to again make the form reflect the content in that, like, because Carl isn't 100% sure what happened and what it means, we also don't really know what happened or what it means. Another thing that I think affects this is that this is a YA book. And if teachers are going to bring it into classrooms, I feel like authors are probably very, especially in this current cultural moment that we're living in, might be a little shy about how much they reveal in scenes like this because they don't want to be censored. And and teachers, if they're going to bring things like this into their classrooms, also don't want to be censored and don't want to, I don't know, have to go before their school board and defend their choices and stuff.
Right.
um or be fired, or whatever the fear is, right? And so I think that that also might be a contributing factor. One of the things that I think is interesting, because we read another book, I think it was called, it's on my thing, Someday We'll Find It, by Jennifer Wilson. I think it's um in it there is also a scene where consent isn't exactly clear. And one of the Whippoorwill committee members had an issue with that. And I understand the issue with that, but I also think it's a really powerful teaching moment, right? Where we can look at this scene together and say, okay, was there consent? Like, how do we, like, we have to help students learn to recognize what consent looks like, and also like how to give it, or how to make sure that everyone participating, like, to check in with each other and to make sure that everyone in who's participating is really wanting to participate. And I think that when we have troubling scenes where we're not sure, that can open really, really good and healthy conversations about what consent should and does look like, and whether or not it's problematic that consent isn't clear in this particular scene. Because I struggle with the idea that, like, the books like this should be teaching, but like should be didactic in some way, right? Like, it's great for students to see healthy, it's great for students to see healthy sex. It's great for students to see what consent should look like, but it's also good for them to see sometimes when things are muddied, because then that helps us understand that, like, they really should be clear. you know.
I
And I
think that
think
that's
that
a
kids like to
sorry.
point out the problems with stuff. you know. Sorry, Maya, I didn't mean to talk over you. Go
No, no,
ahead.
no. Did you want to say that last part and edit it? It's because I talked over you.
Oh no, I think it's good for people to see that this is a real conversation. It doesn't bother me a bit. But so go ahead and say what you were going to say.
Well, I definitely agree with that, but I think that um the tricky part comes in if we're talking about this as a book to teach with students versus a book to have in your classroom library. Because if it's in your classroom library and students are reading it on their own, I don't know that that conversation would take place. And I'm just a little bit nervous that people would read it and think, okay, well, this is normal. When in my experience, I just think that it's a lot better if everybody feels safe, and if the conversation, even if it's awkward at first, does occur. But I agree that, and if we take a look at classic literature, right, there's a lot of things in there that are muddied. There are a lot of sex scenes that do not imply that consent was given. There are a lot of slurs that are used constantly that teachers, say in the classrooms, and we all have feelings about that. But there's a lot of things about classic literature that that definitely take place that you kind of will raise an eyebrow at, but don't, because in my opinion, it's between a straight couple. So then it's kind of like, well, okay, well, if we're talking about a gay couple, the rules are changed in some way. It needs to be much more censored. It needs to be gentler to ease audiences into it. And that is not fair. The same thing should apply for everybody, but yeah.
Yeah, I think that it comes into I think that one of the major factors is the intended audience. So we're talking age, obviously there's a YA book, but we're talking intended age of the students. And then also um have they had experience with, queer literature before? Have they read a book with a queer character? Are there queer people around in their daily lives that, they can look at as a role model and connect to in this book? And so I think that if you're talking about a student who, maybe has never met a gay person in real life, has never read any media or experienced any media with gay people, and maybe they don't have a super, open or accepting view of gay people, I feel like this scene and maybe Andy as a character might be doing more harm than good in that specific scenario, because in my opinion, it's a little too easy to frame Andy as a victim and Carl as a predator throughout the book. Whereas that's not exactly what's happening. It's not exactly what's not happening. And I think that muddying is a little bit complicated when you're talking about your intended audience. Because the goal is to have a student walk away from this, understanding, having a better perspective of what it is like to grow up being gay and what it's like to grow up being gay in a rural community. But then you run the risk, especially if it is a independent reading and it's not a classroom reading, of them walking away and saying oh, okay, Carl is a predator and Andy is gonna move away and whatever. And this, I don't know how to feel about this at the end of the book. So it's just a question of what scenario are you reading this in, and how much can you do to make sure that the conversations that need to be had are being had.
That's a really good point. And I think that teachers probably have those thoughts about a lot of the books that they teach or that are in their classrooms. But I honestly, I hadn't really thought about that before. And I think that's a function of the fact that I haven't been in the classroom for a while because I've been teaching at the university level. And so that's why I appreciate y'all's perspective so much, because, even being in classrooms supervising students or doing research in classrooms doesn't really give you the full experience of being the teacher in the classroom and thinking about the things that need to be thought about because of the things that happen outside of the classroom. And I think that's a really good point. I think both of you have talked a little bit about Andy as a character and maybe finding him sort of sticky or a little problematic. So do we want to talk more about that?
Yeah, I have been adding sticky tabs as I was reading it through the first time, and then the second time I kind of was able to go back and look through and look at the highlighted things, and I just highlighted lines that kind of stuck with me, messages that I thought was important. But all of the orange ones are red flags from Andy as a person. And there are a lot, and I kind of I think that that they kind of do get explained at the end when we learn about his history, and his home life and the way that his parents react to him. Um, but that also doesn't excuse all of the things that he has done and said toward Carl that, you know, just kind of leave me feeling gross and leave me feeling like Carl was taken advantage of and, you know, and then cast aside. Like it does happen, you know, exactly like that, unfortunately, and a lot of the time. And you know, something else that's interesting between the two characters is Andy comes from a family that is not accepting of his sexuality, that wants to change him, that is very homophobic and conservative and Christian, like we've talked about that stereotype. Whereas Carl's family was very accepting, and even his mother accepted him before she died. And it is very refreshing to be able to read a book that has, you know, the realities of, you know, some of the realities of being gay, and having people's reactions to being gay, but also that doesn't end in a horrible tragedy with your parents not accepting you and you not wanting to live anymore. You know, because as I feel like a lot of the time, what LGBTQ stories end in, and it's just heartbreaking to read and not something that I want to showcase happens all of the time for my students in my classroom library.
Mm. One of the things that was really interesting to me about that too is that like Andy is the city character, right? And it's his family that's the not accepting family. And Carl is the rural character and his family is the accepting family. And so I think that was probably done on purpose.
Yeah.
And I appreciate that because it's not always the case, but I think that it's important that like nuances exist. Like we don't like nuance as human beings. Like it's much easier to be like, this is how it is and
Black
this
and
is how
white.
it is,
Yeah.
instead of like considering all of the things that exist between those two polar, you know, those two poles. And so like I think it's really important to you know, to show people that like it's not always the case. You know, sometimes it is, but sometimes it's not. Grace, did you want to say a little bit more about Andy?
I'm trying to formulate my thoughts.
Okay.
He okay. So I liked Andy as a character. However, the like you said, the way that he takes advantage of Carl, and then the way that they don't explain his actions or his backstory or like any possible reasoning for his actions until like I think it's the last like 5-10 pages of the book.
Yeah.
It just kind of like rubs me the wrong way in that like he's he's not validated in his actions. Like he's not is not okay what he does to Carl because of his backstory, but it does explain a whole lot and it does like kind of put into perspective um like what he was doing and kind of why he was doing it. But then that comes around, like you get that explanation and then the book ends. So there's never really like a resolution there. There's never like a I don't know if him and Carl ever really like talk again after they have like their final kind of exchange and that revelation comes around. Like it's just very strange the way that I think that Andy as a character develops because yeah, he's like, you know, the city boy who comes to the rural school and then you know, we find out that like he you know, like all this stuff happened with his parents and his parents are unaccepting and there's everything and there's just like not a whole lot of closure and so you walk away from the book and I don't really know how to feel about Andy. Like I don't know I know that I don't think that he's valid in, you know, the way that he kind of like used Carl. Um but I also if I were to put myself in his shoes, I don't know exactly like where you would end up. You're, you know, where you would go after that. Um and so it's just like it's a little disappointing that the book ends like right there. And I wish that there was, you know, like another 50 pages or so that we could kind of find a resolution.
Yeah.
I
Go ahead, Maya. Sorry.
I kind of like that it ended that way personally, because I think that a lot of life ends that way.
Mm.
I can, you know, think about people that I've had like experiences with, and I know that a common word right now is like situationship, right? You know, you have those people in your head that you think about when you think about that word and about relationships and stuff, and a fair bit of them have not ended in a way that is conclusive, in a way that reads like the bookend of a book, in a way that ends all wrapped up in a bow, nice. And sometimes it does end just like that. Like somebody says something hurtful, and then you say something back, and then you just never talk again. And I think that it's realistic, and I think that the depiction of it happening not only between a straight couple but between a gay couple, you know, it just kind of like that's just a fact of life. It's just, I like that. I think that the humanizing of LGBTQ relationships is very important. We should absolutely normalize it. And I think that the depiction of it in books is important. And that's actually something that I really liked about the book.
I think one of the reasons we find out that about Andy so late is because Carl finds out about Andy so late, right? Like again, like Carl is the driving force of like how and when we get information. And so I think in that, like I think Gary Eldon Peter was trying to be really realistic in thinking about like, okay, like what does this character know? And how would he find out about these other things, right? And so like thinking about the rumor mill and the gossip and the kind of small town characteristics that we were talking about before, like I think that those totally exist in this book, and I think that they work in a way that read to me as really authentic, that like I just really felt like I was Carl, that I really only knew what he could know. And I think that plays out too with his relationship with his dad and learning about like what's going on with the dairy. um, and so as we've been talking, we've mentioned the parental relationships that exist in this book a little bit. And actually that was like Carl and his dad's relationship was like one of my favorite parts of this book because it's so tender but also fraught. And I just thought like, especially like it being like dad's son, and dad like queer son, I thought that was really important. What did y'all think about that relationship?
I absolutely agreed. It was one of my favorite parts too. I think that the care and the accepting and just the way that they talk to each other, that's what it's about. And it's just as I said before, really refreshing to see more representation of parents that love their kids unconditionally, because that is what should happen,
Hmm.
but it doesn't all the time.
Yeah. I mean, it's nice to see like a character who's established as gay from the first page. Because I've read a lot of queer literature, young adult or adult, and so much of it revolves around, your coming out journey and finding yourself and accepting yourself. And while that is a big deal, it's like there's a whole lot of stuff that happens after that. Like that's only a
Hmm.
small part of, living as yourself. And so Carl, from the first page being like, "Oh, I'm gay," and it's not a question, and it's not really even a problem. Like it's just like a thing that is about him, and so that's nice. And then the fact that the parents, the mom and the dad, and even Ellen, are like, accepting of that, and they're not like, it's not even something that's spoken about because it's just like a part of his character, and so that's like wonderful to see. And then I like what you said about the whole like father son relationship, because it's easy for a mother and son to have a really loving relationship, a father daughter, like whatever, but it's more rare, I feel like, to see a father and son have just like a very close loving relationship. They still have their problems,
Hmm.
but at the end of the day, he loves his son and Carl loves his dad, and there's no like question about that. And I think that that's a really nice thing to see, because so much of finding yourself and coming out and all of that is secrets from your family, secrets for safety. And I'm glad that that's not an issue for Carl in this book. I'm glad that we get to see that perspective.
Kind of going off of what you were saying, Grace, about the if finding yourself and coming out and exploring all of that, there was a point in the book where I thought that Carl was about to go and like experiment with Kathy, Cindy, who is
Kathy.
this?
Kathy.
Kathy?
Yeah.
Okay, Kathy. So the new friend. I
Hmm.
was so excited when he was like, here's all of my business, I'm just going to tell you. And then they ended up being best friends. Like Grace, I think, made the point when we were talking about this, that she's a very convenient character to be there at that exact moment, and I completely agree with that. But I also think that was so much better than what I had thought was going to happen, that I was just so like relieved that they weren't going to make him like question his sexuality and then he goes back. Like I do really like that aspect, that he knew who he was the whole time, and he, even at 15, 16, he's who he is, and he's strong, and he stands and he plants his feet in the ground, and that's that.
Yeah. Um, I think Happy is a convenient character, but I feel like there have been convenient people for me in my life, like the person I needed to be there the most at the moment that I needed them the most was there. Like, and there are moments in my life where that hasn't happened either, like, but there are moments when it had. And so I think what I liked about Kathy too, and really, Carl's parents is that like, I think some people have, and I'm one of these people, have like struggle over how to be an ally, right? Like um, how to be there, but like not, I don't know, like not allow their heteronormativity to like overshadow or like,
Yeah.
you know what I mean? Like I just,
Yes.
it's hard to be, especially as a teacher, I feel like in a school, like figuring out how to be an ally for my queer students was really difficult for me, and still is. And so I think that that aspect of this book of like Kathy just lets him be, she's just there to support him, to listen to him, to hear what he needs to talk to her about, and to just like share life, and I feel like that's what successful allyship can look like. And so I really appreciated that aspect of this book too, because I think sometimes um it's hard to know how to support people sometimes. Um, I think it's a little different too in like student, teacher relationships, but like just in general, any amount of allyship from any like majoritarian position, um, I feel like can go wrong in so many ways. And so like figuring out how to do it right, it takes a lot of failure, but it's also nice to see it in literature sometimes. Did you have any questions that you wanted to ask?
1 second.
Yeah,
Sure.
let me look.
I guess you can keep looking. But one of the things that I wanted to talk about that I don't think we have talked about um a lot is like the representation of virality in the book. Like did y'all feel like it was authentic, contrived? Like how did you feel about it when you were reading it?
I felt like it was pretty authentic. I liked that, especially like what we're talking about, that it's from Carl's perspective, and so things unfold in the way that Carl finds them out. That is for me a very authentic form of storytelling. I also liked that it was told in a nonlinear fashion. Like Carl is having flashbacks about this. Oh, he's starting to remember more, so we get to find out more. That's the way that life goes. That's how you remember things that happen like that. Um, and I think that that all made it very authentic. I think that the having the cows in his life being such a constant and always coming back to the cows and always coming back to his mom was such was another thing that made it very authentic. Like that was clearly his way of coping through hard times and of grounding himself, was of thinking about his moms, of going out and milking the cows, of seeing the cows. And that's the part that made me tear up, is just how well grief was depicted as well, because it's so, just like remembering those memories and having them be painful, and then just, letting it ground you and then moving forward and going to do with what you have to do. I think that it was just a really authentic, I would say very authentic. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. And I definitely think that the inclusion of like there were so many like little details that were thrown in there that is something like, I didn't grow up in a rural space. It's something that I would have never even noticed. Like I think his first um look at Andy, like the first analysis of Andy is that he's wearing a clean white t-shirt and he's like, "Oh, he's not a farm boy because no farm boy owns a clean white t-shirt." And then he says so he fixates on his cowboy boots for a long time, and he's like, he's never, milked cows in those cowboy boots. Like you could, you could like shine those into a mirror and look at your reflection in those cowboy boots. And I was like, that's just so, interest. It's so funny, because it's like something that I don't know if I would have noticed or anything like that other people would have noticed. Um, but it just like it really grounds you like in that setting where you are Carl in this book, and so he's making these observations, and then you're going along with it, and you're saying, you know what, you're right. Like he wouldn't have a clean white shirt, like he wouldn't have nice cowboy boots. Um, and then Carl, he always has to worry about his chores. So like, he's every single day after school, he's got to do his chores. And so that's like kind of like what Maya said, the constants, you can really tell like what he kind of like builds his life off of is like he's got to do his chores. He thinks about his mom. Like he goes to school and he gets bullied by what's his name, Kent or something.
Mhm.
Like that's his life, and it's just like so like authentic in the way that it unfolds. where like you learn these details, but you are Carl, so you're not learning, you're just doing it and you're just living your
Mhm.
life. And I think that's a really nice way to like build out that character.
The chores thing was another one of my favorite parts of the book because for me, farm chores were like it was like the best time to think because your body just did what your body needed to do and it allowed your mind to go wherever you needed your mind to go. Like you didn't necessarily have to focus on the work, especially if it was something that you've done like your whole life. It was just this sort of muscle memory repetition of like, I don't know, it's kind of meditative. Like I always felt like my chores were meditative. Um, and I hated them. you know, like I didn't really like doing them. I complained about them a lot, which was another thing that I really liked about the book is like when Carl found out that Andy didn't have to do chores, like his like I don't know, just like his anger and also surprise and also just like why doesn't he have to do chores? You know? Um I just really like that a lot. When I was growing up, we had hogs for a while. And at 8 years old, when we would mark them, like we would get the sows, and they don't like to move. Like you can't like tell a hog to move. So like I don't know if you've ever seen anyone show a hog. Um, but anyway, like what we did was we had these like plywood boards that were like as tall as I was, basically, as an 8-year-old. And I'm like moving, I'm like using these boards to get these sows to move wherever my stepdad needed them to go. Um, and I look out and like my mom and my brother and sister, I was the oldest. My mom and my brother and sister are like outside the pen and watching. And I'm like complaining to my mom, like, why do I have to do this and they don't have to do it? But my younger brother was like 3 years old. And my mom was like, can't carry a board, like I'm like, but Ashley probably could. She was only 2 years younger than me, but she's a lot smaller than me. Like right now she's 9 inches shorter than me.
Oh
um,
wow.
so and my mom said something about like being afraid that the sows would knock him down. And I was like, but like, what about me? you know? And so like I just really that part where he was just like incensed that Andy didn't have to do chores was like it was so relatable. you know?
Such an older sibling thing too. We're
I
both
know.
olders, so yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so I thought that the depiction of rural life was pretty spot on. There was nothing that I felt like, I don't think that's right or that doesn't feel right to me. And I also understand that like Midwestern rurality is not the same as like Pacific Northwestern or, like Appalachian in the mountains or like there are all kinds of different rural Alaska, like they're just all kinds of different rural experiences. But in like the fact that it was a Midwestern, rural experience, like I just felt like it was like it was right, like
Mhm.
I just felt like Gary Eldon Peter got it right.
Is he from a rural? Does he grow up rural?
I think he's like a second generation or a first generation out migrant. But he spent summers at his grandparents' farm, I think is what he said in his so he's definitely rurally connected,
Gotcha.
and would have had experiences that he would have been able to translate into the book. Um, so yeah, like I think that what the authors try to do, especially in the books that we select for the Whippoorwill Award, is strike some kind of balance between like, I recognize that this culture is not perfect, and there are things that, like we should take issue with. But there are also things that are good and hold joy and are beautiful. And I think that that's what Gary Eldon Peter was able to do in this book. Like, there are clearly problems, there are clearly issues. Um, there are tensions and but there's also joy and there's also happiness and beauty, and I think that that's really well done in this book. Yeah, and I really appreciated that, like, the loss of the farm or the potential loss of the farm was a huge part of this book, because I think that, like, farm succession, farm loss, is something, especially family farm, um, to corporate farming, to, around here, it's like housing development, um, and so I think that the sort of the depiction of farm life as like difficult but also enjoyable, and also like the threat of losing that, especially because how it's connected to the people that you come from, um, was really important. His mom loved the farm, not only for the fact that it was the farm and she loved the cows, but because it was tied to her family, Um, and that's why Carl loves it too, and that's why his dad loves it too, but like it's so hard for his dad. The work is hard, knowing whether or not they're going to make enough money is hard, and so and also the connection to his, dead wife is hard. Like he loves it because it is another, thing that was connected to her, that it still connects him to her, but it's also hard because of that, because it still connects him to her memory, and that's difficult. And so I really appreciated that too, because you don't see a lot of that in books out there,
Especially not from the kid's perspective too.
Mm,
That's very interesting to see, is like a parent's grief from the kid's perspective.
mm,
Because when you see things that your parents do in YA literature, it's like, oh, well, this is unfair that they're doing this, and I don't understand this. But his dad, I mean, not that he was like abundantly clear, but it throughout the book has been very clear that it's like not about the mom, it's just about the money. It just comes down to what do we need to do to survive. Um, and I'm still maybe a little bit unclear as to how, like, what changed, like why we can just survive now with the farm. I'm very glad that it happened. I'm very glad that they decided to stay. But I was like, the end of the book, he's like, oh, we're staying. And I'm like, oh, I mean, okay, but like, can you? Is that something you can do? Um, that to me felt like a little bit of a question mark, but
I think I think I think I'm still formulating my thoughts. For me, it seemed to me that the dad's motivation to sell was more about the connection to the mom than it was about the money. So like
Mm.
the money is always a thing. Like the money is always, I mean, like I remember one time I saw my friend's dad in the one gas station in our town, and he was like playing the lottery. And I was like, "Hey Lee, how's it going?" He's like, "I'm just playing the lottery to see if we're going to get to eat." Um, and so like it was a flippant, like sort of gallows humor joke, but it's also somewhat sort of true. Like we were, like in my family, we were glued to the TV during the weather, to see what it was going to do, to know like what it might do to our yield. And so like I know a lot of folks live that way. And for us though, it was crops. And so I'm not as familiar with dairy life. The neighbors had feeder cows and stuff like that, but like there were no major dairies around where I grew up. But I think like there's this idea and sort of rural characteristic of like we will make it work. So like, whatever however hard it is, the dairy is he's realized, I think, that the dairy is important enough to them all, um to continue the hardship that comes with it. I think it was more about the mom than it was about the money. That was my take.
I think you're right about that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
I think that's the only thing that makes sense to me.
mhm. No, I know that one of the questions you asked us is like, as teachers, how would we teach this book? And I would love to teach this book with like a major emphasis on the relationship between Carl and his dad, and then just like looking at like farm life, family life, because obviously the biggest thing that is happening is like Carl and Andy, but there's so much stuff going on in the background, and like focusing on grief and how each character kind of processes. And then like we haven't even talked much about Ellen in this book. She's a stand-in mom for
Mm,
Carl, and then the little sister, who I don't remember her name, but
Anna.
she calls Ellen mom, and Carl has this whole moment where he's like,
mm.
"Oh, my sister won't remember my mother. She'll think of Ellen as my mother, so I'm the only one who knows my mom as my mom." And so like there's like all those different elements that happen like kind of in the background that aren't like the main focus, but I would absolutely love to teach this book like looking solely at those like background elements and being like, how does this all play into Carl as a character, and like his story.
I think it's a really great novel to think about characterization. So thinking about like the standards, right? Thinking about the standards that you could choose to use to teach this, in terms of literary elements and things like that. I think characterization would be a great standard to hit teaching this novel, doing the things that you were talking about. So in our, previous in this conversation, we sort of talked about the trickiness of figuring out, like, is this a whole class novel? Is it something that I keep in my classroom library? Is it something that I offer for choice? So Grace, I think what I'm hearing you say is that you would teach this as a whole class novel. Yes.
If I were to teach it as a whole class novel, I think I would definitely focus on like the
Okay.
characterization and everything. But I do think that it would serve really well as like a whole class novel because, like we talked about, there are some conversations that kind of like need to be had about this book, and
Mm,
so I would feel most comfortable knowing that like I or another adult was like facilitating those instead of just
right.
having a student run rampant with ideas.
Right. I think one of the great things about this book, in terms of teaching it as a whole class novel, is how short it is.
Mhm.
Um,
Mm.
I think there was a recent like ALA blog post, or there was something about how like we need shorter books. Um, and
That's
I think
true.
there's been this like steady sort of movement to just teaching excerpts or to just teaching short stories, because fitting in a novel in classes where we're having to focus on like thinking about standardized testing and like all of that kind
It's
of stuff,
hard. Yeah.
is hard. And so I think that like this is a jam-packed 160 pages, but it is only 160 pages. And so I think that that's also a major benefit of, like considering teaching this as a whole class novel.
Yeah.
Maya, what about you? Oh, sorry, Grace, did I talk over you?
No, I was just gonna say like teaching as a whole class novel, it's like I said at the beginning about the pacing. It's so great because if you were to do like, a chapter a week kind of thing or something, you always have something to talk about. Like there's never a moment where it's like, oh, this is kind of a dead chapter, so we'll just move on from it. Like there's something to talk about, so you can hit every chapter really well.
Very true.
Yeah, that's a good point. What about you, Maya? Is this a book that you would consider teaching in your classroom? And if so, how would you do it?
Um, yeah, I think that this could be cool. I think that a lot of it kind of would depend on what's allowed, because I could see this being something that somebody would say, I don't want you to teach that." Um, but if I were to teach it as a full class, I think that honestly, with the amount of the chapters that we are doing, maybe 2 or 3 chapters a week would be something that could work, just because in my experience so far, it's always more fast paced than you think. At least for me, I tend to underplan. So that's I think that the kids are going to take longer than they do, and I just think that with a fast paced book like this, especially with the curiosity of high schoolers, I would say is what I would use for this. Um, they would want to finish it and they would want to know what happens. They'd be very curious. They would really be into it. So, so that's something that I would do. I would definitely bring up the question of consent. I would want to talk about that. I would want to focus on the setting, because I think that for me, that's the highlight of this book is how, I mean, I think world building is a good term for it. It's so accurate, it's a very good depiction of what rural life is. And especially if I was to teach this in a suburban school or an urban school, I could say, this is I've been told this is what it's like. So you guys should, pay attention. This is what it is. If I were to put it in a classroom library for individual consumption, I've done a lot of thought into my own classroom library. I've got quite a big collection of books already, to go into it. And I'm thinking, there are some of them that I just kind of want students to know some information before reading it or after reading it or whatever. And maybe I could have like a little footnote for those books. I could include like a little note card on the inside of it and just say, just so you know, here's a little, you know what I mean? Like the question of consent would be something big. Or like, here's something to think about as you read this book, having that little caveat to make sure that kids are considering the big pictures while they're reading the book.
I think one way that teachers are getting one way that teachers are getting good books to students in a time where those books would be challenged, is through offering like book clubs and allowing for choice, because then it's like, I don't want my kid to read this book, and it's like, okay, well, they can read another book, you know. Um, so I think that if you went that route, I think one way to make sure that they're having conversations about, problematic aspects of the book, is to hold conferences, with their book clubs, and maybe give them questions that, because you're going to know which books the clubs are reading, and you could give sort of curated lists of, hey, maybe you should consider these questions as part of your book group discussion, because you don't want to get too heavy-handed with it, because it's like, it's their club, like, let them talk about the book. But at the same time, it's like, if you're having trouble getting started, or you're not sure what to talk about, here are some topics and corresponding questions that you might consider. And so when you run reading conferences and you sit down and you're like, where are you in the book? What's going on? What do you like about it? What don't you like about it? And then when you know that they've sort of gotten to that part, you can say, one thing that I'm really curious to know about is how y'all are thinking about this part. Um, and then that can sort of like bring up the conversation. So I think that there are definitely ways to engage with students about, and I think that your strategy is a really good one, of like, not necessarily a trigger warning, but like before you read, sort of like a teacher's note, like there are author's notes, there are prefaces. So it's like a teacher's note, like, teacher's note before you read, consider these things.
I have a
And
lot of
so,
books that could use a caveat like that I really would like to put in a classroom library. And I think when I think back to myself that age, I would have really liked the book. I could have read the book and seen past those little tricky things, but just having that little like Post-it note on the cover or something, just a disclaimer, something like that.
And I think that's another way, another good way to navigate these sort of like book banning waters, is like, well, I let them know what was in it before they picked it, like, it's not like they went into it blind. If they don't want to read it, they can read something else. So, and I think, it's unfortunate that we have to consider those kinds of things. But we do. And I think the things that y'all have talked about are really, really good strategies, for navigating those waters as teachers. I think we've talked about everything, but is there anything else that we haven't talked about that y'all would like to talk about?
Yeah, I think we've covered everything that I wanted to say, and then that we've said to each other about right after reading it.
Okay. I think that it might be clear to most people, whether or not we would recommend it to people to read, but we never really, come out, we didn't say it. So Maya, would you recommend this book to
I
people to
would.
read? Okay.
I
What about
would.
you, Grace?
Yes, I would.
Stamp of approval? Okay. And obviously I would, because I was on the committee that gave it an award. But yeah, so yeah, I really loved it. I loved, complicated is in the title of the book, and I think that is exactly what this book is. Not necessarily complicated to understand, but that it showcases the complexities of life, especially life as a queer person in a rural space. And so I really loved this book. And even though it had some sticky parts, I hope y'all liked it too. And I really appreciate y'all. Thank you so much for being here and talking about the book. I learned so much from our conversation, and I love that y'all read it more than once. Um, and I appreciate the time, because I know that time is a precious commodity that, never seems to be plenty enough. So thank you so much for being here, and I really appreciate it. If you ever want to talk about another book, let me know.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Thanks again to Maya and Grace, and thank you for spreading the word and reviewing us on the Apple Podcast.